Welcome to this presentation on CSS Flexbox. So CSS Flexbox is basically a CSS layout module that allows you to lay out items in your browser. So in the past, we had to use different types of positioning, for example, relative positioning, absolute positioning, which we've already covered in this course. And we could also use floats, like to float different items around in the page and to set up layouts in that particular way. But Flexbox allows us to create beautiful and seamless responsive layouts. And the Flexbox has very high level of support, browser support and browser compatibility. So almost all modern browsers support CSS Flexbox. So a wonderful advantage of CSS Flexbox is that it's very responsive. So you can target many different screen sizes, and it will, in many cases and many instances, it will sort of resize to fit that screen size very well. So in order to get started with Flexbox, you have to apply the display flex property to the container. So it's the containing element in which all the other elements are nested. So to accomplish this, you just go display flex in the following way. So display flex, and the items are aligned in sort of the left-right direction. So from left to right, and this is called the flex direction. And in Flexbox, what you have to understand is that there is something called the main axis. So the main axis by default is a row direction, so it's in the left-right direction. And then what is perpendicular to the main axis is the up-down direction. This is called the cross axis. So flex direction row, this is the default. So this sets the main axis as the left-right direction or the horizontal direction. If I refresh, nothing changes. However, if I go column, I'm now setting the main axis to be up-down direction. So the items are now aligned in the up-down direction in the following way. Okay, excellent. There's also another way to accomplish this, namely row reverse, which is another property. So now, as you've guessed it would move in this direction from the right to the left, right? So we are now aligning the items from right to the left. As you can see, it's sort of to the border here on the right. In the same way, we can have column reverse, and this is self-explanatory, of course. So it just moves in the bottom up direction, item 1, item 2, item 3, in the following way. So now let's just go back to the default. So we set the flex direction back to 0 to normal row, right? We can also just delete this since it's redundant, since by default the flex direction is row. And we'll talk about aligning items in the main axis. Remember, the main axis is from the left to right direction. So in order to do this, we just go justify content following way. And okay, this will align items in the main axis. And remember that it's important to note that the default value here is flex start. So flex start is what we'd see here. So if I were to refresh this, nothing will change. And then another property for justify content is flex end. So they should begin at the end. The items should start from the end there. So item 1, item 2, item 3, right from the end, starting from the end. The last item is put at the end, and there's some space towards the left here. And another property, another value to this property is center. So as you've guessed it, the items will be placed right in the center of the container in the following way. And another property is space between. Now space between would allow there to be space in between the items that are in the middle, while the items 1 and 3 are sort of towards the edges here. And another important property is space around. So space around simply distributes the space evenly around the items in the following way. So let's refresh here. So the space now is somewhat evenly distributed or divided amongst the items in the following way. And of course, there's space evenly. Now, space evenly would, as you would have guessed it, just allow for an even distribution. As you can see here, the distribution is not necessarily even. It's noticeably towards the center most spaces, the distribution is much larger. But now if I go space even, it should be approximately equal. See now these spaces on the edges here are approximately equal to the spaces towards these central regions. So now that we've spoken about justify content property allows for the alignment of items along the main axis. But what about aligning items along the cross axis? So in this particular case, we have to use a property called align. So this will be cross-axis alignment. Let me just remove justify content property. For the align items property, the default one stretch. So default one is stretch, so nothing really happens here. But a cool property is now flex start. Flex start, so it will be at the beginning of the cross-axis. So it will be right here, beginning of the cross-axis. And there's also flex end, so it should be at the end of the cross-axis. So we know that the cross-axis is along the vertical direction, so it will be towards the end of the cross-axis. In the same way, we can put it in the center of the cross-axis using center property like this. So now it will align it in the center of the cross-axis. So the cross-axis goes from top to middle to bottom, and we go flex start here, center, and flex end to align the items in the cross-axis in that particular order. So let's take it back to the top again, and we'll talk about the wrap property very briefly. So I can remove this. Flex direction is row. This is already default, so we can just remove this for now and just go back to normal. Let's refreshed, and item 1, item 2, item 3. So now let's talk about the wrap property. And to declare the wrap property, you go flex wrap in the following way. And typically the default value is no wrap. So it just controls whether items will wrap along multiple lines. So in order to demonstrate this, first I will have to copy these a bunch of times. So I'm just going to select all of these items here and copy them a bunch of times just to demonstrate. And let's just refresh. And you notice that it moves, they sort of bundle together towards the edges here. And another cool thing, let me just add some more just to make this more clear. As you can see, there's some kind of overflow that takes place. And that's where the flex wrap property comes in. So again, we said that the flex wrap by default is no wrap. So let me just go up a little bit here. However, if we do write wrap here, notice something. It's sort of, so if it's towards the edge of the container, it moves along the cross axis and then it aligns the items again. And if I were to add more items, it would simply go to a new line here along the cross axis or along the cross axis direction and align items in that particular way. And in the same way, I could just go wrap reverse here. And you've guessed it, it should move in the opposite direction. So let's just take a look here. So it moves like in the opposite direction. So item 1, item 2, item 3. Just to make this more clear, I'm going to set this to item 1.1. And then the very last item, I'm going to set last item 3. Or I could just say last item just to demonstrate. And voila. So it goes from 1.1 in the reverse direction and it goes to the last item. And we've accomplished this using flex wrap reverse in the following way. Okay, now we'll discuss another property here, which allows for a multi-line alignment. So it aligns the content with this extra space in the cross-axis. So we're going to be aligning items in the cross-axis with this extra space. In the first place, let me just remove this and just go back to wrap. So nothing should change here since it's still wrap. And I'm just going to go align dash content. An important caveat with this property is that the flex wrap property must exist in order for this to work. So align content. In order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to go flex end so that it's extremely noticeable here. As you can see, the items will be aligned along the cross axis, that is to say the up down direction, and you will get this. So the aligned from top to bottom, the up down direction. So flex end. We can also say center like we did previously with the justified content property, but this time we're doing with the align content property, which allows for multi-line alignment. And let's just see here. There you go. So it goes to the center. In the same way, I could just go space between as well. Space between. It should do similar to the previous property that we've spoken about in the justified content property. So we could just say space dash between the following way, and there should be some space between the items here. As you can see, it's along the cross axis. So our main axis is this direction from the left to the right, or the horizontal direction, and our cross axis is from up to down. So there you go, space between. And in the same way, I could just say space around, and there should be space around the items now. So they no longer touch or hug the borders at the top and the bottom. And flex start is another one. So another property here, flex start. Just see what happens here. There you go. So it starts from the top to the bottom here, and there's very little margin, as you can see. And certainly we have already discussed flex end, right? We just start at the end. There we go, just like that. So hopefully the difference now between align content and justify content has been made clear. So align content, just to refresh, is about aligning content in the cross axis. Justify content is about aligning content in the main axis, along the main axis. So instead of using space between along the main axis here, we notice that these items are sort of touching. So I can just go space between, for example, and let's just see here what takes place. As you can see, there's just space between, and there's a lot more spaces. So instead of just having them touch or using this property, we can also use the gap property to allow there to be a gap. So before I use the gap property, first let me just go back to the default. And you know what? Let me just remove the align content property and then just refresh here. And we notice that the items are aligned and they are wrapped using the flex wrap property. And if I wanted to add some gap here, gap to px, and I can use other units, relative units as well. I'm using the absolute unit of 2 pixels, so there should be a gap of 2 pixels between the items in the following way. So that's how you would apply a gap here, some space manually. Excellent work. So that would cover most of the properties that you will deal with when dealing with the properties that should exist inside the container.